Hey everybody, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and for the team who is joining us as well. Unfortunately, we've already discussed I can't send virtual cheese, but we're so grateful. Can I please begin this session today acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we're standing, the Yagara and Turrbal people of the Meanjin, and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also acknowledge all of the First Nations people who may be joining us today. So I was thinking it was last Friday. The weeks are just flying as we finish semester and where everyone's frantically panicking in their marking on campus at the moment. But it was 2 weeks ago now that many of the people in the room and many of our supporters in the room joined us to do the Darkness to Daylight walk from Parliament House in the city. Just a short 3Ks. There were very adventurous people who'd done 110 Ks from that afternoon, and people who, like Kelly, who ran the 10K that morning. But we were proud of our 5K. Everyone was up and ready to roll at sort of 5:30 in the morning. And it was an important event, an acknowledgement that's the second year that we have participated in this event. And as part of and as representatives of not just the School of Public Health, but also of our EDI committee, who has been very much under Lisa and Michaela, very much supporters, obviously, of this particular, our focus and our involvement in the event. And the critical thing that we were wanting to do, we participate, we love to be involved, we like to be engaged, but one of the things that we said, it's all very well for us to participate in the walk, but we need to continue. We're very good at celebrating days and doing things and creating awareness, but how can we deepen that awareness? So I roped in poor Carolyn, who is a former graduate of the school, and I also know from back in drug arm days, and Andrew would know from back in drug arm days. And I said, look, are you doing research in this area? Would you be happy to present? And she just said, yes, absolutely, and grabbed it and ran with it. And then brought on Mel and Jenny and Emily to be part of this incredible presentation to let us know of the work that is happening in this space, because it's very easy to get quite knocked down with all that's happening and the statistics that we hear all too frequently, and the episodes and the experiences that we hear reported on the news all too frequently. But to know that there is work going on and that our great friends at ISSR are conducting research and evaluation on this area is so critically important. So this afternoon, Carolyn is going to present first, followed by by Emily, Mel and Jenny. And we've just been discussing Emily is also a graduate of SPH, so that's really exciting. So I'll hand over to you fabulous people now and let you take control of letting us broaden our understanding and our awareness. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Alison. Hello to everybody, and thank you very much for having us there virtually. Very excited to be here with you and virtually taking part in this really important work that you've been doing to raise awareness and get people thinking and contributing to the important area. So I will hopefully be able to get my slides to move forward and backwards. There you go. So on behalf of the four of us, I'd also like to acknowledge that we're coming from unceded lands. Today I'm down on Yugambeh lands at the Gold Coast, so Jingaree from here. I know the other guys are over again at Turrbal and Jagera lands at Long Pocket. We'd like to pay our respects to the ancestors and their descendants and thank them for their ongoing care of country and their contributions to our ways of knowing and being and learning, very importantly, and to recognise any First Nations people with us here today, but also to recognise the lived and living experience of the victim survivors of domestic and family violence who contribute to all of the work that we do. So very briefly, for those of you who don't know us, as Alison said, I'm an SPH grad, as is Emily. I did my PhD with Jake and Gail and Rosa Alati using the MUSP dataset that many of you will be very familiar with. Emily has done work in this area. Mel came to us from down at Macquarie Uni, and Jenny has been a UQ graduate all the way through, I think, from memory. No? Correct me.
Not quite. So I did my bachelor degree at QUT, but that was a very long time ago. And then I worked in the sector and then came back and did my PhD in sociology and anthropology. So yeah, hi.
Thanks, Jen. So what we're going to do today is take you through a little bit of some of the areas that we've been working in. So because this is such a big and vexed issue, we know that it exists on many different levels. And so the interventions that are taking place around us also happen at many different levels. So we're going to start with me talking about some of the work that happens at point of first contact with the justice system and how that works. So talking about the use of body-worn cameras to take victim survivor statements. Emily's done some work looking at the specialist courts that handle domestic and family violence, and she's going to talk to you about that. Mel's been doing some work with communities that are trying to help victim survivors navigate the challenges around engagement with the court system. And Jenny's going to be talking about some in-country and in-community work that's being done on the ground with people. So getting to look at different levels of interventions and how we work to improve things. So just for those of you who aren't terribly familiar with ISSR, we're part of UQ. We sit over in the Haas faculty and we live over at Long Pocket, which is this funny little branch at Indooroopilly that I didn't know existed until we moved there. But we're a collective of people from lots of different backgrounds, some from health, some from education, some from sociology, some from criminology. And so we are able in that to pool our backgrounds and look at different levels and different aspects of the challenging program. So when I was at SPH, we were constantly looking at the social determinants of health. We kind of flip that and look at how health can be part of the challenges, but also part of the solutions for people to have really good participation in society at many different levels. And so we're looking at how to weave all of these challenges together, not only to understand the background of the challenges that people face, but then the solutions that can be moved towards with that multiple framing. So no further ado, because I've said to everybody, we've only got a short period of time so we can all talk. I'm going to talk about some work that we were doing with the Queensland Police Service, which is started a couple of years ago when they introduced the use of body-worn cameras to take statements from victim survivors at the point where they went out to respond to a call. And that was done for a number of different reasons. The idea is that the victim survivors are at risk of further trauma when they engage with the criminal justice system. They have to tell their story again and again and again. Because they're presenting evidence, it's often the case that the perpetrators who are part of their circle can intimidate them and prevent them from giving further evidence. And because the evidence traditionally was taken by a police officer in a statement room at a police station, it's written down, it's using very formal language, they're not able to provide sort of evidence of how this event is affecting them right then and there. And so that doesn't translate into taking them into the court system when these offences are being dealt with. So what it ends up doing is that the victim survivors sometimes decide not to testify because they can't deal with that trauma, or they've been intimidated for not going from going down to the police station, or that the evidence that they present becomes dry and it becomes discounted when it does hit the court system. So the idea is to reduce the trauma and to increase the impact of these statements. And so that was introduced as a trial in two places, at Southport and in Ipswich in Queensland. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how that worked. So the police had to have extra training to do this work. There have been a background of use of the body-worn cameras for going out and taking statements, sexual assault issues, and sometimes with child protection issues. But use in this case was new. The police decided they would roll out trauma-informed policing training to all of their officers. So that was a big step forward, and it's a bit of a milestone to take a new attitude to working with the victims of crime. So that's been quite impactful across the police force. They also had to learn how to use the cameras because they don't just sit and talk to the person. It's actually set up separately, and they speak to the victim survivor and encourage them to tell their story in their own words. That involves a bit of interviewing skill that not all police officers have. And those of you who've worked in qualitative research will understand, of course, that interviewing skills are really quite something special, to be able to bring out the information without leading somebody. It became a mandatory practice, so it was to be offered at every time that officers attended an event, but the participant was required to give consent. So there's some challenges around people in a traumatic situation actually understanding the implications of giving consent to this process. For the police, it had some interesting effects. It was new technology, so it always takes a while to bed down something new. The uptake of trauma-informed practices was a bit of a leap for some people who'd been in the force for a long time and had a different way of thinking about working with people, but others found it incredibly valuable, and took it up in spades. There was some variability in the levels of interviewing skills, and that's an area for ongoing development. The other challenge is that there's a risk of these videos capturing other information because you're sitting in a person's home. There's chaos around. All sorts of extraneous information might be captured in that video that shouldn't be necessarily part of a statement that goes to court. From my own background, it's often a case that substance use is included in the environment one way or another. That's extraneous evidence that doesn't need to go there. So there's some challenges around capturing just what's necessary. Then there are issues around how that recording is used. So at the moment, the system is that it's stored in the police evidence system, and it's used to inform the prosecutors, who then create the briefs of evidence. The defence lawyers are able to view the recording, and the defendant, the respondent, is able to view the recording but not take it away. And then the idea is that it's to be used in court as evidence, so it can be played in the courtroom and save the victim survivor, again, that event of having to tell their story. You've got a challenge when you have new technology meeting long in place systems, particularly in policing, where the prosecutors are used to receiving a written brief from the evidence and being able to just pick things out of it really quickly. One of the things they found that they had to watch the entire recording and think about what's being said as they pull that case together. And the legal representatives of the defendants were also saying that the process took them a little bit longer. On the upside, the respondents appeared to plead more because they knew that this video was an evidence, and the idea was that we would be able to test in court as part of the evaluation what the quality of this evidence was and how it was going to be regarded, whether it was going to be sufficient, and how much impact it might have on the decisions that are made in court, particularly around sentencing. So we had a lot of contact with people who were part of this ecosystem, the people who were supporting the victim survivors, the different levels of people who are involved in the justice system. Interestingly, that quote on the right in blue was actually from an operational police officer who was saying that they considered it a really big win because they were actually able to listen to the person giving their statement rather than be going, yep, yep, and taking notes. They were able to do that, and the person was feeling heard. So that was a really big bonus for the person who was actually the victim survivor in that situation. And that was very helpful for their engagement. The challenge from the legal side of it was the cogence of the evidence, and you can see that quote in the quote down the bottom there. How the evidence is taken, making sure that only the right information is captured, but all of the necessary information is captured. So rather than the police officer using a pro forma and just filling in the blanks and using very technical policing language, the free form was a little bit challenging to make sure everything was captured, and that people weren't being led as they were given their statements. Really importantly, because the whole thing was about supporting the victim survivors, did it really make a difference for the people who were most vulnerable in this? Because of the timing of the evaluation, we found that none of the cases that we were looking at actually got to court. And that might be something that Emily talks about in her session. So we were talking about what happened in the processes up to that point. The support workers told us that many of their clients found it easier to give their input, their evidence in their own words, to be able to express themselves. It was easier for some people who had language issues because they didn't have to worry about literacy when they're signing forms. Sometimes the communication of the consenting process had a few challenges there, and that the comfort of the situation really depended on the interviewing skills of the person doing it. The other thing is that it's very immediate. So it's at the incident to which the police have been called. So it may be that the person doesn't have a support person with them at that time. That could be a bit of a challenge. Whereas if they do choose to go down to a police station later to give a formal statement, they can arrange to have somebody with them. So some pluses and some minors. And some people apparently felt a pressure to get this statement right the first time because it's on camera. What we did hope, though, was that having had the opportunity to make that statement, they weren't having to go back and tell the story again and again and again, and there was some positive feedback about that. The big thing was, were the perpetrators being held to account by this? And we noted before that some of them seemed to be more likely to be pleading guilty because this statement was there, it was very concrete, and some found it quite confronting to have to view that statement themselves. We're not certain about the impact on sentencing because we hadn't had any cases go to court at that time. What we did find, though, was that the increased number of people who pleaded guilty hopefully would have taken things through to a sentencing and then removed them from the ecosystem of the victim survivor. So what we would say about that is that it's a really good idea. It presents some amazing opportunities to reduce some of the trauma using a systems approach, but it all comes down to how well it's executed and the ongoing support that still needs to be provided. Technology is a wonderful thing, but it can't go without the people that need to support it. It comes down to the way people are trained to use it and then to use the systems that it feeds into. So very important first step, and it looks as though it's going to be rolled out more widely across Queensland, and hopefully that does offer some ongoing opportunities, but it's only one step in the journey. But it's such a horrendous journey that perhaps if we can make small increments along the way to improve things, then that will give us some bigger improvements down the track. So I'm now going to handball over to Emily, who's going to talk to us about her work looking at the Southport Domestic and Family Violence Specialist Court. So Em, over to you.
Thank you, and I'm so pleased to see that you're going to keep driving the slide deck because working out how to share it on my own would be a bridge too far. So I'm Emily, and I'm going to talk about the Southport Specialist Domestic and Family Violence Court Justice Response, which I led the evaluation of down at Southport between 2017 and 2022. I think obviously, this evaluation links to the conversation about domestic and family violence, and it's one of the reasons I'm sharing it here. But I'm also sharing it because I think it was a really impactful evaluation. As evaluators, we don't always have the opportunity to have other people read our work and to have it, lead to other outcomes. So I'm excited to share it from that perspective. And it was also a really fundamental evaluation for me as a practitioner. I learned a lot, and it kind of coincided with a lived experience of the court justice system myself. So I'm giving you all of those perspectives today. So the Southport Specialist Domestic and Family Violence Court Justice Response is the big name for the court at Southport. And the specialist court model came about because of the Not Now, Not Ever report that Quinton Bryce delivered in 2015. And through that task force, which was like a comprehensive evidence gathering process, the task force heard ongoing stories about how the court justice system could further victimise or marginalise women and children or people experiencing violence who had come to the court seeking kind of safety and refuge, but not having that experience because of the way that the court justice system works. So for at a very high level, for an example, it is possible for perpetrators to use the court process to make it more difficult for a victim survivor to seek justice. A very simple example is not by not turning up at court, the matter is adjourned and it's not closed. So the ongoing impact on the victim survivor is that they don't have closure. And the key difference in the specialist court model is that it's staffed by people who are specialists. So they understand things like the example that I've just given you, and they're making their decisions within, the limits of procedural fairness. From that understanding of a victim survivor and violence more broadly. So the model includes dedicated magistrates, and by dedicated it means a magistrate who both has understanding and awareness and training in DFV, but also a magistrate who is only seeing that list. They're not seeing other civil or criminal matters. They're dedicated to that particular list. There's a dedicated DFV registry, which again is staffed by people who have broader understanding and awareness of DFV, and so they understand the experience of victim survivors and perpetrators who are coming to court, and they provide the administrative support that sits around that. At the hub of all of this, there's a specialist court coordinator. You'll hear me talk through, and you can see here on this slide that the specialist court model itself has got a whole bunch of moving parts, and it's the specialist court coordinator's job to coordinate those parts. So bringing together the specialist court services. So in Southport, there's the Domestic Violence, DVPC, Domestic Violence Prevention Centre, which runs women's advocacy service from the court. That includes a safe room where victim survivors go before and after. They can choose to go before and after their matter. They have direct, safe access to the court. They can appear from the safe room if they want to. They don't have to be present in court. And then there's a whole bunch of social services that service also provides in addition to the physical safety of the room. Specialist police prosecutors, Caroline mentioned just before that, police are learning more about DFE, but they don't necessarily have broad training in DFE, whereas the prosecutors who appear in the Southport Specialist Court have all been trained in DFE. Equally, the DFE registry will make referrals for the people presenting at the DFE court to specialist duty lawyers, who are provided by LAQ, Legal Aid Queensland, and again they have training in specialist DFE, and there are also corrections case managers. Sometimes the people involved will be being held in custody, and so the people from corrections who are involved are also specialists. So the evaluation itself, I'm not going to talk specifically about the methodology of the evaluation, but as social researchers yourselves, I think you might have heard of these data sets, and you certainly will have heard of the mixed methods that we use to do this evaluation. Some key data sources were the quick outcomes data set for Southport. And we also compared the specialist court model to the enhanced model, which has some of the features of the DFB court, but not all. And that is in Caboolture and Cleveland, which is just a standard magistrates court. We tried to use some IAMS data, which is the integrated offender management system that corrections holds. It wasn't the most easy to play with data set, and we didn't get the full benefit of it in the evaluation. And there's substantive evidence for the evaluation came from a document and literature scan, stakeholder interviews, stakeholder survey, and some interviews with clients. So on the next slide, I'm going to point to some of the high-level findings. And again, I'm talking at the really high level, and after I've done that, I'll talk about some of the insights I think that coming from this evaluation. So ultimately, we found that the specialist court model is fulfilling its purpose. And although there was an emerging quantitative evidence base, there was comprehensive and compelling evidence from the qualitative evidence that the model is doing what it's supposed to do, and we hope that in future we'll be able to understand, the quantitative impact on women and children and perpetrators being held to account through the specialist court model by looking at the quantitative and administrative data sources. One of the things that I've been an evaluator for 15 years or so, and I've I've done lots of evaluations of interagency models, and I've never seen an interagency group working together in the way that the Southport interagency group did. That operational working group, which includes agencies who don't necessarily like each other sometimes, you know, police, courts, all coming together with a really clear and shared understanding of risk, particularly for women and children. And that shared understanding of risk really permeates through the court's operation, and it's one of the fundamental factors that makes this thing work, as is the fact that the court acts as a hub for further connection to service, and that's the case for both victim survivors and for perpetrators who are connected as they wish to be to further supports. Of course, one of the things that, you know, we would hope to be able to measure, and the quantitative data allowed us to look at, was the number of DVOs and TPOs which were issued, and that number increased over the time that the court was being implemented. As I said, women's safety is supported by the physical separation of the aggrieved and the respondents by virtue of the safe room, which allows women to go there before and after court. It has a separate physical entry into the court. So for women who are choosing to appear in court, they don't have to, you know, they're not going to bump into the accused. And there is the opportunity for them to give evidence remotely from that safe room. And there are substantive security measures in place which again support that before, during and after safety for victims, survivors. So our recommendations were to expand the court and to pick up on those best practice features and make them available as much as financially is possible across the court justice system. And you know, one of the cool things about this evaluation is that's exactly what it led to. So the evaluation was picked up by the Hear Her Voice report and cited as evidence there. And subsequently, or in conjunction with that, the specialist court model has been rolled out to 5 additional sites across Queensland. So that's kind of cool. It is so cold in my office. I have got such bad shakes. So I wanted to share some other kind of insights coming out of the evaluation, and I think I reflected that your evaluations, you know, don't necessarily always lead to change. And I think in this instance, what made a difference was that the evaluation was being delivered in conjunction with a groundswell of public and political focus on domestic and family violence, particularly the conversation around coercive control. I will absolutely never forget interviewing a magistrate in the Brisbane Magistrates Court offices at the top of George Street, and sitting there having this conversation with him and hearing sirens, all just like more sirens than I've ever heard. And it got to the point where we were both trying to ignore it. And then I said to him, "That's a lot of sirens." And he said, "It's never good." And that was the afternoon that Hannah Clark was murdered. And so that's the conversation that was going on in the newspaper and you know, dinner parties and in the schoolyard as we were working on compiling the evidence for this report. And I think the other thing that made a really big difference was our clients' understanding of this within the context of the receiving environment and their ability to kind of go, well, this links to recommendation 165 out of, you know, the Not Now, Not Ever report. And this relates to the Hear Her Voice report in this particular way. So the way that we were able to write the evaluation was reasonably compelling so that it was easy for policymakers to pick up and to use to kind of point to and say, well, we're doing this thing against this particular recommendation. So please give us more money and let us roll this out more broadly. And I think from an individual perspective, I think there's this idea about what a safe space is and what it looks and it feels like to different groups of people, and how that impacts on the people's willingness to access justice and to seek justice. And that's something that we're continuing to explore in other evaluations that we're doing at the moment. And I think that's a reasonable segue to Melissa, who is going to talk about a piece of work that's going on in Rockhampton.
Perfect segue. Thank you very much.
Hi everybody, I'm Mel. I'm just pulling up my notes. Thanks very much for having us along today. What I wanted to talk about is a program that is being piloted in Rockhampton at the moment. It's contracted by Victims Assist Queensland and as part of the Queensland Government's commitment to supporting victim survivors of domestic and family violence. And the team, myself and other team members at ISSR have become involved to evaluate the program. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about the purpose of the program and the elements of the program which we're assessing to determine if the program is effective and thinking about how the program could be strengthened or improved. So the program itself is a 3-year program aimed at supporting victim survivors of domestic and family violence through the criminal court justice system during a criminal proceeding. So the pilot is about halfway through at the moment. We're about midpoint right now. And it aims to fill a gap where, particularly for victim survivors who have experienced a fair amount of trauma, going into a courtroom, speaking in court, facing the person using violence against them is quite an intimidating experience. And historically, there is a tendency to drop out of the process. So the program has been about providing emotional and physical support for victim survivors leading up to their court trial, including providing information around what they can expect and what is expected of them, and during the court trial as well. So there is a case manager who attends court with them in the hope that they will continue with the court process and not drop out in the lead up, so that there is a greater chance of justice for victim survivors. And it's also hoped that as part of this process and with the right support, victim survivors will feel less intimidated and could actually feel empowered as part of completing this process. So the program, it's not around prevention, it's directed more at the tail end of the journey. And it would seem obvious that to determine if the program is effective, if it's worth the investment, then we would need to speak to victim survivors in the program, which we are doing. But I wanted to tell you about the other elements of the evaluation. So to gain a more holistic approach to the evaluation and determine whether the program has the sufficient foundations to be effective and to understand what those key elements are, we're aiming to look at the broader program more comprehensively. So we've started the evaluation across 3 phases and we finished the first phase where we were looking at the inputs in the program. So this is really to determine whether it had the foundations to get up and running. So some of the questions that we asked, the things that we looked at were, are referrals coming into the program? Because you kind of think you can develop this great program and it would just be up and running, but are people actually coming into the program? So we needed to think about whether the service provider had developed the connections in the community with Queensland Police, courts, the hospitals, so that eligible participants or clients would be referred into the program. Do staff have the legal expertise and the skills in case management? Do they have the background in social work or a related qualification to mean that they could provide that legal expertise, but also provide the emotional support for people who were in the program? And do they have capacity to fulfill the case management that is required? So if the program is successful and referrals are coming in, then case loads are going up. And do they have adequate capacity to be able to deal with the numbers that are coming through? On the next slide, I wanted to tell you a little bit more about what actually happens in the program. So once people are referred into the program, there is a fair bit of risk and safety assessment and planning undertaken as part of the journey through the program. Victim survivors are then provided with information about the court process, including getting more clarity around what they can expect, what's expected of them, potential outcomes of the process, and timeframes of the process. They provide assistance with developing victim impact statements. They engage in negotiating with courts on behalf of clients, particularly if there are special needs involved. The service provider also has a safe space near the courtroom. So I don't know if you've been to the Rockhampton courthouse, but there's one entry in, it's the same exit, and everybody goes through up the same staircase, down the same staircase. So the service provider does have a safe space near the courtroom where victim survivors can go to before their trial and just go in just before they need to appear in court. And the case manager, who has been the support person along the entire journey, is also present as emotional support for victim survivors during the court trial. So in addition to all the provision of information that they are provided with and the check-ins, I think what really underpins a lot of the success of the program is having that trusted relationship with the case manager. That if the case manager says that you need to go and speak to this person at courts, or it's expected that you undertake this activity, they need to have that trusting relationship with the case manager to feel confident that, okay, this case manager has said that this is the next best step for me. I feel comfortable to do that. And also the provision of support in the courtroom too. It is important that they have that strong relationship with the case manager for it to feel like support. So another component of the evaluation was to determine how well the program is being delivered in terms of the quality of services. So things that we asked are whether the activities are being delivered as intended. Are they culturally safe? Are they aligned with trauma-informed practices? What are the challenges to delivery and how can they be worked around? And we also needed to think about who is in the program. Do they reflect all of those who are eligible for the program, or is there a good representation? Or is there a reluctance from some groups to engage? And if so, why? And how can this be addressed as the program continues? And finally, on this third slide, it's part of phase 3 is to look at the effectiveness of the program. And we would hope that the program is effective for clients in that they feel safe in the courtroom, they feel supported, they feel informed during the court process, and to a greater degree than what they would have if they didn't participate in the program. So while much of the evaluation for the first 2 phases involves speaking with the service provider staff, reviewing program documentation, program data, this final phase is where we're seeking the voices of program participants and asking, do they feel more confident and empowered as part of this process, safe and informed about what to expect in court from this process? And if not everybody does, why not? What are the barriers? And we hope that collectively, the findings from all 3 phases of the evaluation can then be used to identify limitations with the program so that they can be addressed, particularly if there are thoughts about continuing the program or expanding it more widely. So we want to be able to identify lessons learned, I suppose, to inform future programs so that it can be strengthened. And I think that's probably a good time for Jenny to jump in and talk about other programs.
Thanks, Mel. Hi, so I'm Jenny. I'm an early career researcher. I've been at ISSR for 2.5 years now. And so, yeah, as I said, I worked in the social work sector for 15 years after doing my bachelor degree, and that was mostly in domestic violence and refugee resettlement services. I worked in the DV specialist courts, not Southport, unfortunately. I worked in Richlands, Inala area, which is nothing like Southport, and Holland Park, which is probably a bit more similar. But based on my work experience, that has been my research in my PhD and my previous postdoc, looking at service and policy responses to refugees and migrants and the issue of domestic and family violence. And so I've ended up, I'm a qualitative researcher, and most of my work has been with frontline workers from refugee and migrant backgrounds, so not survivors, but workers in this space. And, you know, taking an intersectional approach, so learning through centering the experiences of marginalised groups. And there's a lot of literature that, you know, talks about problems with the law and frontline interventions. And so I guess what started, and even since, you know, I started in the sector in 2007, there was a lot more capacity to do case management work and, you know, have time to take a trauma-informed approach and you know, sort of, I guess, try out different things and, you know, be very client-led. And then over the years, more and more responses to domestic and family violence are very much centred on legal reform and, women leaving, so going into shelters and things. And so I guess there's a lot of literature that, highlights problems with the law. So Heather Douglas, I think she's at University of Melbourne now, but she was a professor at UQ. She talks about legal systems abuse. And so as Emily mentioned earlier, perpetrators using the legal system to inflict abuse on survivors. So yeah, that can be delaying tactics. It can be, financial. They might engage lawyers and then I guess quite commonly also, they take out cross orders, which means the woman will take an order out on them and then they'll take an order out on the woman. And it just, and then obviously going, to hearings and court and going through the court process, which, as we've heard, can be quite traumatic for women. Inconsistent responses by police. And I think that that's for everyone, but certainly when you're talking about refugee and migrant women and other marginalised groups, for refugee and migrants, there's a lot of racialising practices. And, there's, instances where police will show up, a woman will call and police will show up. And, the woman might not be able to speak English and will be quite heightened and very emotional. And the police will take a protection order out on her instead of the husband, or, they'll buddy up with the man and just get his side of the story. There's in the 27, so they do the domestic and family violence death reviews. And there's a 2017 report that found for Indigenous women, for every Indigenous woman that died because of domestic violence, she was charged as a perpetrator at least once. So that's very telling about, how the law can be harmful for marginalised groups. In saying that, in my research, I've actually found that refugee and migrants actually want the law. And there's this idea of transitional justice where they, they don't sort of have their, sometimes new emerging communities, or even if they've been here for a while, they're sort of in this transitional stage where they don't have the community processes to address it. But yeah, I'll get to that a bit more. Women leaving, so that's often the only option when women approach a service for help now, is either to get legal help or to, help them leave to go into a shelter, which there's not enough shelter places to place everyone. Often they'll get, if they're in Brisbane, they'll get sent to Rockhampton or something like that. So they have to take kids out of school and uproot their lives. But it also, there are also systemic inequalities that come from women leaving relationships. So poverty, homelessness. So even if they do get into a shelter, finding long-term housing after that can be very difficult. For refugee and migrant women, there can be a lot of social isolation. So they can often get ostracised by their communities. Imagine, for newly arrived refugees coming and being in the country for 3 or 4 months. And then, you leave your husband and you get sent to somewhere like Rockhampton and you don't have any community around you. You don't speak English, you've got, kids with you. It's very overwhelming. And so, one of the jobs that I had in the sector, because there's not enough shelter places, we used to visit women in hotel rooms who were waiting, like they'd been placed there by DV Connect while waiting for a place in a shelter. And many women go back because of the social isolation. For a start, they're stuck in hotel rooms for 2 weeks in a single room. They're not allowed to go outside. Some of the hotel rooms don't even have windows, and the people from our service that we're visiting, are the only people that they see. So I think the poverty, homelessness and social isolation, like many people go back because of that. And I guess it also puts responsibility on the women, so without holding men accountable for the violence. So it's that old adage of, women are expected to leave while the man gets to stay in the house. And yeah. And then for services, as I said, like services lack capacity. So, you know, despite the many millions of dollars that are given, you know, to address DV, the frontline services don't see a lot of that, and they are very under-resourced and lacking in funding. They have very limited options to support victims and survivors. So, as I said, it's, you know, linking in with police in the courts or leaving. And, you know, if they stay, it's sort of a safety assessment, and that's about it. And they're very, you know, high turnover because it's, you know, that vicarious trauma and, you know, just very, very high workloads. And I think the frustration of not being able to provide effective support as well. So I've been very fortunate at ISSR to be able to, you know, build on my previous research. So I am doing 2 current evaluations at the moment. So the first, which is actually finished, we're just writing up the report for it, is the evaluation of the Family Peacebuilding Program. So this was funded through a seed funding grant through the HAS program last year. Sorry, through ISSR last year. And it's a program that trains community leaders from refugee and migrant communities on how to better respond to domestic and family violence in their communities. So it started out as a very community-led volunteer initiative in 2010, so a very long time ago. And it's really been a labour of love since then by the community leaders that were initially involved. And I won't even say 3 services, it's 3 workers from those 3 services that have basically done it pretty much in a voluntary capacity, you know, and yeah, I've found it's not without its problems, but it's certainly a unique initiative and an example of, you know, community, you know, trying in the midst of, you know, a lack of culturally appropriate services, they're trying to develop something new for their communities. And then the other one, which is a commission piece, is called the Community Healing and Accountability Program. So that's a pilot program being run out of Inala Community House. It actually involves the services from the Family Peacebuilding Program. So they kind of link together, and where the Family Peacebuilding Program sort of trains community leaders, the Community Healing and Accountability Program provides more of that wraparound support for survivors. And they've developed sort of what they call pods. So they sort of build a pod around a survivor, and they kind of get to do a lot more of that trauma-informed practice. So an example that I came across was, you know, a woman she asked for help decluttering her house, which the worker was like, I know this woman, you know, the house sort of building up with mess, and it's a trauma response because of the DV, and she just needed help decluttering her house. And so they, you know, found an organization that could help with that and can do that. So it's sort of, it's going really back to basics of just those basic tenets of support, and, you know, support being very client-led, understanding that, you know, trauma affects everyone differently, and that, you know, people have different needs and wants when it comes to support. And yeah, and it takes a very prevention and recovery approach, and is really aimed at, both of these programs are aimed at building the capacity of community to respond. So some initial findings and impressions from these 2 programs. There's a great commitment from concerned and frustrated workers in the sector, and also community leaders of refugee and migrant groups. But there's a lack of resources, and, you know, because it's looking, so mainstream agendas in a way are kind of taking up the space and the funding and not allowing for difference. So it is very, it's all going into legal reform, and, you know, the DJAG stuff, which is warranted, but because it's such a tightly controlled agenda, I guess people wanting to do different things aren't able to access that funding. Community leaders are tired and overworked. So what I've found across these two programs is there's immense unpaid labour. And you've got women in, refugee and migrant communities that, because of all the barriers that refugee and migrant women face accessing mainstream services, I've met women that have been running their own self-funded organization for 10 years, and they just have people, like they'll have 10 women at a time staying in their house and doing everything for free for them because, they can't get other services for them. Community leaders, I think there's a lot of expectation that community leaders step up and, contribute through lived experience or provide those sort of bridge building things but, people forget that they also have day jobs as well. And so the community leaders I've spoken to are sort of overwhelmed at, working their day jobs, and then weekends they just spend all their time, like liaising with police and, doing that kind of work. Workers are trying to turn back to these core tenets of good practice and trauma-informed practice, but they're very constrained more and more by risk and accountability. So, safety, what happens if, a woman is murdered on their watch, like, the police, everyone turns to them and, turns over every stone saying, okay, what steps did you take? Like, what did you do? And so that is always in the back of people's minds of, being accountable for safety. The other thing that's come up, which goes back to that it's not without its problems, is the need to centre refugee and migrant women's experiences, needs and wants for support. So in doing my work that focuses on frontline workers from refugee and migrant backgrounds and community leaders, those people haven't necessarily experienced domestic violence, and sometimes the interventions prioritise community and family cohesion over women's well-being and safety. And so that's the next piece of work, I guess, that and I've got a couple of projects in the works that are looking at progressing, centering refugee and migrant survivors' voices, and looking at knowledge translation, place-based, co-design, and these projects of, there's sort of two different projects that are doing different things, but at the end they have this really nice outcome of bringing together the mainstream DFE sector and community leaders with the voices of women survivors and sort of agreeing on commitments going forward. So yeah, so I'm really excited to be progressing this work and seeing what comes out of that. So thank you.
Thanks very much to everybody. It's fascinating to hear the work that's going on at so many different levels and so many different angles being taken to address this really challenging era. Please, if you have questions, we'd love to talk to you further about it. So Alison, over to you to manage any questions and things. And we would really enjoy the chance to continue the discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Carolyn, Emily, Melissa, and Jenny. That was brilliant. It's great to see the incredible work that is going on, and also the movements forward that's happening. Thinking about the way in which you've just presented, there's such clear ties between all of your work, and you sort of think, are we moving towards hopefully one day a system where it all comes together and can provide that support? Like Carolyn, your work about the video recording, I could see instantly going into Emily's court, and then the support by Mel and all the rest of it coming in. It was just great. So enough from me though. In the room, if we have questions and also questions online, please feel free to either, I'm not sure if people can turn on mics, but pop questions in the chat. But anyone in the room, key questions?
I mean, from our perspective, one of the really exciting things about having so many people at the school involved in the walk, is that you're raising money because, as we can see from the presentations today, the system stuff is being quite well funded as part of the Queensland government's cross-agency whole of government work to address the root causes, but also the impacts of domestic and family violence. But so much really important work is going on out in the community at grassroots level, led by people who are really passionate, but trying to do it without that government structure and funding. So the fundraising that you guys have been doing is absolutely pivotal to support that work. So huge congratulations to you all for contributing to that. That's just magic. I think, yeah, and Jen, maybe jump in if I've got the wrong end of this. There are lots of opportunities for us as professionals to contribute to this area, both the research that we do, which gets published, eventually finds its way into interested ears. And we're lucky at the moment to have a political environment where this is nationally an area of great concern. A lot of work's being done looking for solutions to take things forward. So as researchers, if we have material that can contribute to those solutions, our traditional avenues are to go for publication in peer-reviewed journals. Think about contributing to parliamentary inquiries, making submissions to public inquiries. Jump on that and write in a different way to what we're used to. Think about how we make our work really digestible for the public who care passionately about this stuff, but don't necessarily understand the beautiful multi-level models that we create when we're trying to tease out which are the effects that are most important in a system. Thinking about how we communicate our work is really pivotal, and looking for every avenue to do that. On the other end of the scale, fundraising that's being done, if there's a cause that really excites you, get out there and volunteer, become involved and contribute. We need to work with people who are specialists in the area and can be trained, but there's a lot that is small scale that can be done by anybody and everybody. So if we look at those opportunities, it creates a lot of environment around what can be done as well, that positive contributory environment, which changing attitudes is absolutely key. Em?
I was going to pick up from what you've said there and think about, it is sometimes it is difficult, and there's conversations that you potentially walk away from to maintain your kind of social cohesion. But I think those conversations that you might have, challenging attitudes and behaviours that you might bump up into in the schoolyard, or you might bump up into against in your friendship network, and being able to draw down on those, what as a practitioner, to be able to say, well, actually it's not like that at all, and the research shows, because I think those are the conversations that contribute to making change. And I think it requires a bit of bravery, but I think all of those small kind of building blocks lead to something bigger.
Absolutely. Emily, I'm not going to be able to lose the image, because we do a lot of life course research in the school and get people to think about connection points of where they were when. And I'm not going to lose that image of you doing that interview. That's just mind-blowing, absolutely mind-blowing. Any questions? I noticed that we've got 1 minute, so I might leave it there. But again, Carolyn, Emily, Jenny, and Mel, thank you so much for just continuing to push forward with this really important work. A thank you from Kim, who was on the walk with us on Friday, so that's wonderful, for all that you're doing and all that you're continuing to push forward with. And we will continue to do everything that we can within the school to draw attention to this incredibly horrendous issue. So thank you so much for presenting for us today. We really, really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you.
Bye.
If there's anybody in the school that's online and is in the building, there is food down here, so come and join us. But thank you so much, Carolyn. Sorry we can't share, but we're sending it to you virtually.
Thank you so much. See you.
Thank you.